Rich Western nations talk about the importance of love, scientific temperament, and human rights, but all of this appears to be completely ignored or forgotten when it comes to the sexual satisfaction of those Western women whose actions in poor or developing countries have caused grave human rights violation or exploitation. But enough is enough. As a woman who comes from Europe, I am not afraid to raise my voice, and I hope my voice is not silenced or ignored.
Point 1. Western women and their foreign male sex slaves. When it comes to female sex tourism, it has been observed that hundreds of thousands of Western women have traveled to poor or developing countries for their own sexual satisfaction. Research by Shared Hope International mentions that these Western women who look for sexual satisfaction abroad could be teenagers or even grandmothers. And of course, not all these women are single. But there is even more to it. On occasions, it has been seen that these female European tourists took these foreign men back home to their countries and kept them in their home. But not all stories can be expected to end well. For example, this research project mentions that many Gambian men have been brought to Europe by their female European sponsors. But since immigration laws are rigid in Scandinavian countries, these African men were often at the mercy of these European women. Not only that, it also mentions that some of these men were held as sex slaves and were shared amongst the friends of these European women. How heartbreaking and inhuman does that sound? And this study mentions that in Sweden, a 56-year-old mother kept a 25-year-old African man at her home. But quite strangely, this 56-year-old mother would tell the African man to leave the house and go to the cinema on Sundays. Want to know why she did that? Well, the lady's grown-up children visited her on Sundays. Point 2. Money, goats, gifts, Maasai and the Western female sex tourists. This is the Maasai tribe of Africa, an integral and a valuable part of our global indigenous cultural heritage. It may break your heart to know this, but even this beautiful indigenous community has not been spared by the female sex tourism industry. Professor George Paul Mayer's article, which is available on Harvard University's website, reveals how one old white woman buys some goats and a bicycle for a 20-year-old African man she sleeps with. Not only that, she is proud she has a Maasai. But that's not all. The sexual objectification of these African tribals takes place openly, and even their traditional attire and their cultural dynamism or expressions are seen through the lustful eyes of many Western female sex tourists. Please go through this text to understand how Western female sex tourists prefer those African men who are in their traditional cultural outfits. Would it be right to say that these white European or Western women are preying on the poverty and the vulnerability of these African tribal communities? Point 3. Sexual exploitation of impoverished underage males by rich white European women. This research project, which was financed by the European Commission, mentions that in Gambia, some respondents have spotted women with underage men, and female tourists having sex with boys is seen as a danger for the future. And this research project explores the behavior of female tourists from the global north in Gambia. During an interview, one African man observes, "These women come here and use their money as weapons. They know that we are poor, so they use their money as weapons to get what they want from us. Sex is their number one priority." The study also mentions that these global north female tourists have the capacity to exploit Gambian men by fully taking advantage of unequal global power and economic structures to pursue and satiate their racialized sexual desires and fantasies. Point 4. HIV, genital infections, and the Western female sex tourists who seem to be blinded by lust. It has been observed that in the Gambian tourism-based sexual economy, it is difficult to negotiate condom use, which in turn contributes to higher rates of sexually risky behaviors. And this study cites research that suggests that women on holiday are less likely to use contraception or protection against STDs than at home, and sex tourism is making this problem worse. And of course, this is despite the fact that among the sex workers, the STI rates are far higher than in general populations. The Human Rights House Foundation, which is headquartered in Norway, reported that HIV infection rates amongst the Maasai were extremely high. And this data from the World Bank reveals the prevalence of HIV in Kenya and other African countries. Despite all this, why are these European or Western women acting this way? After all, how can we afford to lose our scientific temperament and be exposed to all these health risks? Point 5. Foreign tourists, commercial exploitation, and the Maasai tribe of Africa. You may have seen YouTubers from Germany, the US, or elsewhere visiting the tribal areas in Africa, sometimes jumping, dancing, or hanging out with Maasai people. All this may be very interesting to watch, but of course, not many are aware of the other side of the story. It was reported that the Maasai were being forcibly evicted so that tour operators can turn their homelands into vast nature refuges for wealthy holidaymakers. This study from the US-based think tank Oakland Institute explains how thousands of Maasai were left homeless in a move that appears to be a matter of grave human rights violation. But have we done enough to highlight what has been taking place in these regions of Africa and what is being sought after by many female tourists? And of course, it must be mentioned that when it comes to female sex tourism, there are many destinations that are outside the continent of Africa. Latin American countries, Asian countries, the Caribbean, the list is quite long. But can the global community afford to ignore the horrific sex crimes committed by the citizens of some of the so-called happiest or richest nations in poor and developing countries? Why should we not dare to go beyond our Western society's cleverly projected shiny surface, underneath which an ugly reality that involves crimes, health risks, torture, and disrespect to human dignity thrives? See you again.